Now, the music that we're going to listen to this week is totally different from what we heard in the past of 20th century music. And if I play this now, Vaughan Williams, Fantasia on the theme of Thomas Tallis, you will hear that it's completely different from serialism or atonality, expressionism. Now we reach a stage where the composers actually wanted to go back to the past, and the composers that we're going to listen to this week, they're called the Neoclassicistic composers, and they reached back to the classical time, to the Baroque time, and they followed some of the characteristics of these kind of music. But they also mixed it with the 20th century music. Neoclassicism describes a style in the 20th century music characterized by a strong reaction to late Romanticism. Thick, congested textures for huge performing forces were replaced by a clarity of line and texture characteristics of music written before the Romantic period. So clarity of line is like the classical time. The expression of intense emotion was deliberately avoided. So all these strong emotions of the Romantic period, they wanted to avoid. Some composers turned for the inspiration to the classical period, to the music of Haydn and Mozart. Others looked further back to the time of the Baroque, taking Bach and Handel as their models, or Purcell or Monteverdi. In England, Vaughan Williams drew inspiration from the modal style of the Tudor church composers, and this is the one that we're listening to now, Fantasia on a theme of Thomas Tallis, also in his Mass in G minor. Tippett integrated within his own distinctive style the springy rhythmic texture and imitative counterpoint of Elizabethan magical composers. And there we have two of his compositions, the Concerto for Double String Orchestra and the Second String Quartet. Neoclassicism, in fact, denoted a reworking of style, forms and techniques, characteristics of any period whose music predated and was untainted by the 19th century Romanticism. Typical forms and designs rediscovered by neoclassical composers with the toccata. We know the toccata means to touch. We heard that in the compositions of Bach. Passacaglia is also a dance from the Baroque. The Concerto Grosso is a form from the Bach. Fugue we did from Baroque, and ostinato devices we also had in the music of the Baroque. But although neoclassical composers looked to the past for inspiration, they gave their music a very definite 20th century flavor. Abrupt modulations, that's very 20th century. Sudden melodic twists, harmonies that suits this 20th century now, often containing deliberate wrong notes or making use of polytonality. Motor rhythms may be used to drive the music relentlessly forward. So although they use the forms of the classical and the Baroque and the Renaissance music, their rhythm and their melody and their harmony is still very 20th century. So this is a question that you have for this week. If you listen to the music, how do they make this 20th century music? So they give this a 20th century flavor. Abrupt modulations, sudden melodic twists, piquant harmonies, often containing deliberate wrong notes. So notes that is a cluster or dissonant and making use of more than one key. And motor rhythms may be used to drive the music relentlessly forward. Now there we see the textures are often polyphonic rather than homophonic. with clashing dissonances throwing the separate lines of counterpoint into sharp relief. So that is, the texture usually is polyphonic, and clashing dissonances throwing the separate lines of counterpoint into sharp relief. Orchestras became limited in size, presenting instrumental timbres which are sharply contrasted. Okay? So the timbre is also a 20th century thing, sharply contrasted. Now, because they want to avoid any emotion, the neoclassical style is often deliberately cool, emphasizing the sound of wind instruments and percussion rather than the more expressive strings. Typical works in neoclassical style are Stravinsky's Pulcinella, a ballet based on tunes by Baroque composers, mainly Pergolesi, his Concerto for Piano and Wind Instruments, and Symphony of Psalms, Hindemith's 4 concertos, Opus 36 for piano, cello, violin, and viola, and his concert music for brass and strings. Poulenc, his Ballet La Biche and his concert Champertre for harpsichord, you see that Baroque instrument and orchestra, and many of Prokofiev's works, especially his opera The Love of Three Oranges, his piano concertos and sonatas, and his classical symphony composed, as he explained, as Haydn might have written it if he had lived on that day. So you're going to do on the form assignment 78. Now you're going to find yourself a nice composition that you like, and you're going to mention the features of neoclassical style that you hear. So you're going to say what makes this neoclassical and how they incorporate the old tradition with the 20th century features. And in what ways may neoclassicism be described as anti-romantic? So let's look back at why this is anti-romantic. It is not as heavy as romantic music. You see there, it's a strong reaction to late romanticism. Think thick congested textures for huge performing forces were replaced. So those big orchestras of Wagner and Strauss, they replaced by a smaller orchestra, and they had clarity of line and texture, characteristics of music written before the Romantic period. So that's one of the differences. And then the intense emotion was deliberately avoided is number 2. And then we also know that they tried other sounds, and they emphasized the sound of the wind instruments and percussion rather than more expressive strings. So that is the third one that you have. With number 2, I have 3 things making it anti-romantic. Okay, and then this one is very important for this week. Listen to one and say. So we're going to listen now to Pulcinella, the suite, the Sinfonia by Stravinsky. You hear it sounds very classical, although this is now 20th century music. I hear the structure there. Okay, I hear the woodwinds there to make it a cool, a cold sound. There it sounds 20th century with that rhythm and a little bit of dissonance there. Sustained notes. And I can hear that the timbre is quite important here. hear that cult sound that they want with the woodwinds there. So let's listen to another one. Now the gavotte, it's also a dance. We remember the Baroque dance, the gavotte. You hear that cold sound of the woodwinds. And you have that rhythm, the motor rhythm, driving it forward. But I can hear this is Neoclassicism because I have a very definite melody. It's for a smaller orchestra, and it's not as emotional as romantic music. There I hear a little bit of that dissonant with the clashing notes. So the woodwinds are quite important. This is also part of the Pulcinella suite. I hear a definite music melody. And there you hear the woodwinds quite strong, so it's not as big an orchestra as the romantic timing, and you hear that cool sound there. This is still Pulcinella, the ballet. Here the sound is very classical, but it's very important that you understand the 20th century things that is also featured here. Here the brass instruments quite important there. Here the percussion is quite important there. And this is now the ballet. And this is melodies that I know from the classical time that he uses here. It's a nice thing to go and watch this whole ballet. And this is now Neoclassicism for the week.